Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, King. It's good to see you. It's always great to spend this hour on Wednesday morning with you. Can't wait. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what's your spiritual energy number, Reggie?
I'm choosing to be a 10 this morning. So I'm learning lessons from one of my good friends, King, who talks about how you feel and then choice about how you show up. And so I'm coming in at a 10 because I want to make sure I belong here.
Great. Well, I join you equally. I'm a 10 as well. Like I said, the engineer in me, the logical thinker, I see no value in choosing a number less than that. Again, I say that to folks that the number being from 0 being life sucks to 10 being life is awesome. It's a number we choose, not a number that we just are at because of certain circumstances that might be happening in our lives. It's a number that we choose because it incorporates your mental, your physical, as well as your emotional and spiritual energy, and all of that encompassed in that number. So thank you for sharing with that.
Yeah.
And as we go on with our show, our next segment we get into is our gratitude moments. Would you like to go first, Reggie, and share what you're grateful for this morning?
Yeah, so I'm grateful for my standard fare is I have a refrigerator that works with food in it. I have indoor plumbing. I can get hot shower, cold shower, and I can flush a toilet, and that's a big deal. It sounds funny, but it's most of the people on the planet don't have those two things, which I forget sometimes. So it's good to remember it. And I'm grateful for both family and friends. I had lunch yesterday with a cousin who was kind of my big brother growing up. He was 6 years older, lived about 20 minutes away. And he was kind of my hero. He was a good basketball player. I always joke with him that in hindsight, I wish he had been like a cross country runner because I was much better at cross country at running than I was at basketball. But I'm grateful for people like him, who are still in my life. And I have good friends, including you, and kind of a network of cousins around the country that I still have, irregular but real contact with. So I'm grateful for all of that.
Excellent. And I'm grateful for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. Also grateful for mother who's alive, as you say, roof over my head, food to eat, electricity, indoor plumbing. Take that definitely for granted. So appreciate you helping me realize that that's not something that should be taken for granted, but definitely something to be appreciative of.
Yeah.
I'm also grateful for. I was actually had to rehome my dog this week, my last dog, and I came to the decision mainly because she's a very sweet dog, and I think she may have been to run the litter, so she didn't really get beyond. She was 15 months, so wasn't grow beyond her 21 inches and 40 pounds, and she loved affection. She always wanted to be affectionate, and my reasons for getting the dog was a guard dog, so she wasn't what I was looking for in a dog in context, but I did care for and love her. But I'm grateful that I found a forever home for her, a woman who was actually looking for everything that I just described, the sweetness, the affection. She found that in a woman, and the woman was so grateful to have her and live with a woman who had a dog, and just the perfect situation. So, and she sent me photos ever since, and my old dog, I should say, is extremely happy, and she's getting the kind of love and attention she wanted. So I'm grateful to have gone through that experience because of that. It taught me a lot about dogs, for one thing, as well as me as an owner and as a person who had to get used to taking care of someone else. Not having kids, you get, at least for me, I stay in my head most of the time and give me someone else to focus on. I'll tell you one thing that's I've had dogs for the last year and a half now. This is my second day being able to wake up and not immediately have to worry about getting my dog ready and getting them set and walking them and feeding them and getting them situated all before the podcast. So I'm grateful to have that experience and looking forward to journey in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. That sounds so. Congratulations, and I'm sorry to hear it, because it sounds like you did what was best for you, and ended up being really good for the dog as well. But it had to be a little bit of a sense of loss, I'm guessing, or missing the dog for a bit anyway.
It is, and but like I said, for the most part, I'm happier for the dog because I wasn't going to put her in a shelter. That's definitely was not an option for me.
Right.
And I really took my time and found her really a great family because I didn't make any money off of her. That wasn't my goal, but it was really to find her the best situation where someone would be extremely happy, give her affection, and give her love, and I found it. So I'm very pleased that that situation worked out the way it did.
Yeah,
It has, I should say.
yeah, great.
So, our gratitude moments being shared. How about you walk us into our discussion today?
Yeah, so so as folks who have listened in before or watched before know, we're discussing my book, Healing America's Narratives: The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow, with the tagline of Becoming More Fully Human. And specifically, what we began doing about 4 weeks ago is we're taking a close look at each of the elements of the collective national shadow of the United States. So I identify 9 elements of shadow, and shadow is simply what we don't see, what's outside of our field of view, what we deny is true about ourselves as individuals, organizations, or nation. In this case, we're speaking about the United States. And so the 9 elements, just really quickly, I'll say them out loud, are ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. And we've taken a deeper dive into ignorance and arrogance in the last 2 sessions. And today we're going to zero in on fear um, as part of the underlying shadow of the United States. So, talk about what we mean by fear, what we don't mean by fear, how it shows up, how it has shown up, and what we might be able to do with and about it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So just to jump in, as um, fear is really for me and this is not, I didn't invent this language, or just I learned this from people who have who study emotions and who study human nature. Fear is really a future based emotion. So if I'm in the middle of great pain, that's painful, but it's not fear. If I begin to dwell on what might happen if the pain doesn't go away, or if I'm going to get sicker, or if my injury isn't going to be cured or remedied, that's fear. So if I worry about the future, that's fear. So there's rational fear. Rational fear keeps us alive. Um, in a moment when, if I was on a safari and I was out with the lions and I was in a open, Range Rover or something like that, and the lion came charging towards the vehicle, and I got scared, that would be rational fear. Right? Because or if I was swimming in the ocean and a shark came nearby, that would be a rational fear, because bad things can happen with large animals, and that's a rational fear. If I'm walking somewhere at night and somebody comes up behind me and sticks something in my back and says, "Give me your money," and I'm get terrified, that's a rational fear. Um, our ancestors had rational fears of saber-toothed tigers and other animals which kept them alive. They learned how to run and hide, and they learned the behaviors of these animals. Since we've lived in a more industrialized and information age society, um, very rarely do most of us have encounters with wild animals. We do occasionally, but even with bad actors as humans, most of us rarely have confrontations like that. There's a lot of it, but statistically speaking, the odds of being a victim of a crime, are low, larger in some places than in others. Um, but what we do have a lot of fear of is other people in general, whether it's based on their sexuality, their race, their political standpoint. Um, and we live in a more or less constant state of a continuum of concern, anxiety, and fear. Uh, Some of it is grounded in real things like climate change and global warming. You and I were just talking before we get on the air about we got 8 inches of rain in about 15 hours in parts of New York State and Vermont 2 or 3 days ago. Major damage, one loss of life. And so some people are afraid of what's happening with the planet. But if we go back historically, this is the examples I want to kind of dig into. The Europeans were ignorant of, arrogant towards, and fearful of the Africans they encountered on the continent of Africa. So they decided to subjugate and enslave them. They were ignorant, the Europeans, again, were ignorant of, arrogant toward, and afraid of the Native Americans they found here, the native peoples of the American continent, we now call Native Americans. And so they massacred some of them, they took their land, they entered into treaties and then broke the treaties. And it was because they were afraid of what they didn't know. So there was really the intersection of at least 3 shadow traits historically. Historically, men have been ignorant of women, have been arrogant toward them, and not so much were afraid of them as feminine represented in themselves. That's part of what the book talks about. Men are afraid of that, feminine energy, which is the energy of compassion and mercy and community, because we've been acculturated as men to be individual and aggressive and real men, quote unquote, which is really toxic masculinity or unhealthy masculinity. So the fear shows up in a lot of ways. I'll bring it to the current state of affairs in the United States. One example, and you and I have mentioned this before, but he's a good example. So Ron DeSantis is the Florida governor right now. He's running for president. He's running for the Republican candidacy. And almost his entire campaign is based on getting his constituents to be afraid of others, to be afraid of the woke virus, to be afraid of anybody in the LGBTQ plus community, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexuals. It's all fear-based. Now, we can have whatever opinion we want on being woke or not woke and how that manifests. We can have whatever opinion we want on members of the LGBTQ plus community. But to operate from a place of fear of other human beings who, in fact, are not harming us is kind of the example I mean by a non-rational fear. And that's part of the shadow of this country. We went into Vietnam because of a non-rational fear of the Soviet Union and or China taking over Vietnam and the domino effect of communism taking over all of Southeast Asia. So even though we got out of there, we didn't win in Vietnam. Vietnam wasn't controlled by China or the Soviet Union. In fact, Vietnam had been chasing out foreigners for more than 4 times as long as the United States existed. They had to kick out the Chinese first. They had to kick out the Japanese during World War II. After World War II, they had to kick out the French. And then when we went in, they had to kick us out. So they've made it really clear that they'll outlast anybody who tries to take over their country. Now, whatever they choose in terms of their economic system and political system, that's up to them. If we believe in self-determination, but we were afraid. So we don't, if you ask anybody, the leadership of America, Congress people, presidents, any party, military leaders, does the United States behave out of fear? Nobody says yes, but it's been an underlying factor in almost everything we've done. Not the only factor. I'm not saying that. Ignorance comes in, arrogance comes in, definitely greed comes in. But this fear thing is what keeps so many of us apart. Again, whether it's gender, meaning men and women, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's racial, whether it's religious, it's fear of the other. And it's really a powerful force for separation and othering, basically othering in general. You're not like me. Whereas, we're all part of the same species. Um, and there are a lot more reasons to embrace each other in terms of what we have in common than there are to reject each other where we differ. But it seems as though, you know, about half of the population of this country doesn't see it that way. That was rather, kind of trying to be all encompassing in terms of setting the stage, but we can take that in whatever direction we want to go.
Well, I think it's definitely a great topic. My initial question comes to mind as you were talking about, and as you reference in your book, the atrocities that happen, the women subjugation, the women being subjugated to the hate and the marginalization, the enslavement of Africans and Native Americans. My question: do you believe that fear was always the precursor or a catalyst for the evil that was subjugated on those particular um, groups of individuals, people?
So early on, in the first encounters, let's say, with the Europeans and the people of the African continent, and the Europeans and people of what we now call the Americas, um, I think fear was in third place. So I think fear played a role, but I think it was fed by ignorance and arrogance. So basically, I come upon these people. I've never seen anybody like them before. I don't speak the same language. I don't understand their ceremonies or their rituals. They dress differently. A big part of it was they don't know about Jesus because the Europeans coming, to Africa and to the what we now call the United States were primarily Christian. A lot of the Portuguese and the uh, Spanish were Catholic. The French, I guess, were Catholic as well, many of them, and the British were Anglican, were Protestants, but they all had Jesus and Christianity in common. So it was there was the fear of this other, this ignorance of the other. There was this arrogance. Oh, these are pagans. They haven't found Christ yet, so we need to convert them. And then there was one of the other shadow traits, which we haven't gotten to yet, but I'll just mention now, is greed. Because in terms of enslaving the African people, they were used throughout the country. But the last place that slavery really lasted was in the South for the plantations, so that the plantation owners could make more money by doing less work.
Right.
And so there was the greed part, and fed by ignorance because they didn't believe that Native Americans or Africans were fully human. And you can find that in court cases and everything else for if you look back far enough. So fear was definitely there, but I don't believe it was the first thing. I think it was fed by ignorance and arrogance. And then once one difference between what happened with Native Americans and people who became African Americans was that for a while early on, the Native Americans were able to, and it was because they basically had a home court advantage, and this is an oversimplification, but they were able to fight back. When they would like Wounded Knee or the Sand Creek Massacre, where the U.S. Army went in and massacred women and children and desecrated their bodies. The Native American chiefs basically said, okay, if that's what they're going to do, then we're going to do that too. So they would go after settlers. The Native Americans, for the most part, especially on the East Coast, didn't attack the Europeans first. They responded, and then once it got out past into the West and past the Mississippi River, when they bumped into the Lakota Sioux and the Apache and the Comanches and everybody else, they saw what was happening, and they said, all right, we're going to fight back. The people brought in the boats across the Atlantic in shackles who were taken from their culture, from their land, in most cases from their families, they didn't have the opportunity early on to fight back because they were in chains. And so that's a difference. But it was a real fear. Eventually it became really fear based. I mean, I think post Civil War, the relationship between whites and blacks in this country, from the Jim Crow and the lynchings, I think that was more grounded. I mean, ignorance was still there, but I think the primary motivator there was fear. In as, oh, we enslaved these people for hundreds of years. Now they're free. They're going to come for us. So I think fear was a much more powerful emotion post Civil War among whites in this country than it was early on with the Europeans, which was primarily fed by ignorance and arrogance, and because they had advanced technology, they had done more with metals and iron, so they could shackle somebody with chains and lock them in a steel cage with a key, and think that was okay because they had dehumanized them. They didn't see them as human. They saw what was different, not what was alike. So I don't know if I kind of spread that out a little bit, but fear was definitely there. But I believe that the fear is typically bred and developed through ignorance and arrogance when it's non-rational. Again, when Sparky, the green-eyed German Shepherd, pushed the gate open and came after me and put my wrist in his mouth back when I was 30-something years old, that was rational fear.
So you were actually attacked by a dog?
Yeah, unfortunately, at the time I had a motorcycle, so I had a motorcycle jacket on. So he didn't do. If I had been in short sleeves, it would have been worse. But I had a couple of layers and a pretty good leather jacket on, and I feel bad, but I didn't know what to do. And but I feel really bad about this. But what would I do if a man had grabbed my arm? I would have fought back. And with the dog, I was scared. And I punched, and then the dog's name was actually Sparky. He didn't look like a Sparky, but he was a big dog. But I punched him right between his eyes as hard as I could. And he let go and he ran away. And I was terrified. Like my heart was racing. I did what I had to do, but I felt bad for the dog. So that was a rational fear for me. Okay, this dog has my wrist in its mouth, and I don't know what's going to happen next.
Now that I think about fear as relates to common day, and particularly as it relates to the political landscape and how politicians on both sides of the aisle use fear as a motivator to get folks to come out and vote, because they realize that fear is such a strong motivator that a lot of times, to your point, you just described when Sparky attacked you don't necessarily think, you just act.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where our political leaders want people to do. They don't want people to think, at least critically, about what you're saying. They want them just to act and respond. So whether it's, the woke virus, if it's coming from the right, or it's climate change and its immediate impact and its effects, saying things like, if we don't get things together in 10 years, we're going to be, all the icebergs are going to melt, and then the sea is going to be overrun in 10 years, making those kind of projections to get folks to do an immediate action. I would say that now, with that being said, that brings the question, how do you see fear playing a role in just day-to-day human relationships? Let's say not from the opposites of black and white or male and female, but people just coming together in general. How do people surpass that initial fear of the unknown? Because I don't know you, woman, man, transvestite, LGBTQ plus member. I'm going to have some fear about the unknown. how do we go about getting beyond that to actually engage in a dialogue with someone that we look as an opposite?
Yeah. So my, and I'll be really clear. Okay, my belief about that. So what I believe is true about that is being the first one. It's kind of like what you said. What we said earlier about um, spiritual energy, choosing to show up as a 10. So I want to use that kind of metaphor again for this to answer this question. Um, I believe that risking being the first one to trust the other is the way to go. In other words, um, until somebody's willing to put down their gun, bad metaphor, but to holster their weapon or drop their weapon, which in this case the weapon is fear. I'm using that metaphorically, um, and just treat the other person as though that I'm trustworthy and you're trustworthy, and engage in that way, not attack. Um, until enough of us are willing to do that, the fear is going to remain. Now, I think there's actually there's good news on a small scale. There are many organizations around the country, in fact, around the world now. One that comes to mind, it's called Braver Angels, and what they do is they teach people, but they also they stage conversations where people from the political left and people from the political right come together to discuss issues with the understanding that they're going to do it in a civil way, that they want to learn from each other. And that organization continues to grow. They had a big conference last weekend, some really good speakers. I wasn't there, but I'm on their list. So I have a lot of respect for what they're doing. My previous book, Enough with the Talking Points, Doing More Good Than Harm in Conversation, was about that very thing. So we rarely see this in Congress. I'm going to just go to Congress as an example, and we rarely see it in the paid news celebrities, commentators, because they get paid by keeping things divided. So I can make everything sensational. But there are people in the country now who you don't hear a lot about them because it's not a sensational story. And there are others besides Braver Angels. Braver Angels is the one I've paid a lot of attention to. They invite people to come together, both in person and online, leave their weapons at the door. And again, weapons meaning fear and mistrust. And engage in conversation. And they know how to do it. So they have some guidelines and how we do this, what you can do and what you can't do. Among the things, you don't use sweeping generalizations, you don't label people, and it's so that I think is what needs to happen. There's another organization. There's a new political party called, I think it's just called Forward, and it's founded by the former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman, I think is her name, and the former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. They came together, and they don't say where they stand on issues, but what they're primarily doing is they're getting involved in local elections. Getting back to what you've said numerous times, because they're not trying to impact who runs for president or Congress, but they're trying to go in the grassroots to get people to come together, change how voting takes place, like the ranked voting, that type of stuff. And so Braver Angels and the Forward Party I know less about, so I'm not giving them an endorsement, but I think they're doing good work at the local level. So things like that are important, but I need to be able to walk down the street in a neighborhood where I'm not the gender or orientation or racial majority, and look at somebody who's different from me and make eye contact and say hello, just as a start. I tend to, I grew up in Yonkers, and I did a lot in New York City growing up. And when I go anywhere and I'm walking in public, I look at people and I say hello. I mean, if I'm in Manhattan and there's 1,000 people on the street, I don't say hello to everybody because I'd be exhausted.
Right.
But typically, I go shopping, I go wherever. I'm in the parking lot, and somebody walks by me with their shopping cart. If they, if they're close enough, I say hello, and if they're far enough away but they make eye contact, I always just say hello. Most people look up and seem happy that I did that and say hello back. So it's just, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt until they give you reason not to. Now, that doesn't mean you get on the subway with $50 bills hanging out of your pockets. We're not saying be stupid, right? Because
Right.
you're not inviting trouble, but you treat people as though they're just other people on the planet trying to live a decent life, because that's what most of us are doing. The troublemakers are a minority, and there's a lot of them because there's 8 billion people. Even if 1% of that are troublemakers, that's a lot of people. But be the first person to leave your fear and distrust at the door or in the parking lot or wherever, and engage people as though they're good and kind, because most are. That's my best answer and my true belief.
Now, again, let's talk about, are you defining fear? Let's say the fear a person has of the uncertainty, of the unknown of another individual because they're different, compared to the fear a person may have of public speaking or failing. You putting both of those in the rational category of or classification?
That's a really good question. So let's just take the fear of public speaking, because it's kind of, not that it's easy, because I'm comfortable with public speaking. I think you are. And so, but I know some people that are terrified of it. And so in one regard, they're really scared for whatever reason. And maybe they're not good at it. So maybe their fear is based on that. So I don't want to get too caught up in how to label that. If somebody's really terrified to get up in front of a group, I wouldn't say, oh, come on, get over it, man up. I would never do that. It's a real fear. But it's not the same fear as the rattlesnake that's about to strike on the trail in the park, in Tucson, Arizona, or something like that. That's okay, something really bad could happen here, physically bad. With the rattlesnake, if I allow myself to get struck, which is typically due to carelessness, because snakes don't come after people, they get disturbed by people and they strike, generally. But I can test my fear of public speaking in a safe way. I can try it with my friends or family. I can join Toastmasters or some kind of safe place where you can learn about it and just check it out. And so maybe you can overcome that fear. I don't think it makes sense to overcome the fear of a rattlesnake biting you, because that's a rational thing. You don't want to get bit by a rattlesnake.
Right.
So I have bear in my neighborhood. I've had bear in my deck. I'm afraid of I don't live in fear of them. I love them, and they're far enough away. I go out with my camera and I photograph them, but I know how quickly they can move. And so I make sure I'm way closer to the door of my house than I am to the bear, because I don't move that quickly anymore. So I have a healthy fear of bear, but black bear in Connecticut, for the most part, don't attack people. So
I was asking that question more so in the context of, as we talk about this journey of becoming more fully human, and I look at myself personally on a journey, and I know that I don't think I do, not from a conscious standpoint, maybe some unconscious is there, fear of folks who are different from me, whether it's someone who's a different color, race, someone's different culture, someone's different ethnicity, someone's different sexual orientation. I don't have that fear because I'm more along the lines of grow and learning and love. But that does not prohibit me from having fear of failure. I work towards failure in my career, failure as relationships romantically, right? So that's why I was asking that question. It's navigating that. It's like, because I don't have because I don't have fear. I have a general curiosity about someone else who's different than me,
Yeah.
and I'm looking to learn from folks who I don't know. Now, the more you know of someone of that who's different, the more you know. Like if you know a lot of gay people, you don't have any fear. I think that lessens the fear. Just like a person that you talk about your, offline, we talk about your Dominican son. The more white people he knows, the less he's going to have fear of white folks, obviously. Um, Now, if white folks don't know him, and he seems to be one of the few Dominicans that they run into, and he has that look of dreads, and based on his size, there's going to be some fear. So, my question now, with that context being said, do you think the work that you're doing as a coach within your company, Fully Human, it's Fully Human? What was the full name of the company? I'm sorry.
Fully Human at well, right now it's really we just use Fully Human, but the original name was Fully Human at Work.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That work that you're doing there, is that designed specifically to deal with a lot of the non-shadow elements, and particularly as a person getting over their fear in each of those areas? Would you say?
Um, yeah, I mean, I mean, shadow definitely comes into the coaching at times. Some people need it more than others, um, uh, but fear is definitely part. It doesn't underlie everybody's coaching topic, but it's present in a lot of them. Often, what I try to and I don't I don't know what the right thing is for you. I don't have a prescription for everybody, so I
Right.
try to help one person at a time based on where they come from, where they're coming from, and what their particular issues are with their family or their job or whatever it happens to be. But um, sometimes the fear, like just like the fear of failure, for example. Um, if you and I have read a lot of the same things, and most of the really successful people that we have read about or that we know failed a lot before they became successful. So, do we? Do I want to fail? No. Do I want to fail publicly? Definitely not, because that brings the perception of humiliation or embarrassment or whatever. But we kind of know that if we fail at something, we can be okay. Like we know that maybe you don't know that when you're 12 or 16, but I know it. I have more. I have I have hundreds of rejection slips from publishers. Now, is each one of those a failure? I mean, back from my 20s. Um, I didn't think of them as failures. That's how the business works. You send it out, you either get it back or whatever. I got cut from basketball teams. That felt like failure when I was a kid. But I learned a lot of lessons and wrote my first book based on those experiences. So I think a fear of failure is a learned response, and probably I think it comes from ignorance, um, because we don't know when we're younger what failure really means. Um, it doesn't mean I'm a failure. It means this particular attempt didn't work out the way I wanted it to. Does that make you know? Read Abraham Lincoln's biography, man. He lost I don't know how many elections, state and local elections, before he became president. Um, and that's true with a lot of people in the public eye. A lot of writers, a lot of actors and musicians failed a lot before they became successful with their art form or whatever. Um, so I think there's that ignorance thing again, leading to fear. If I really understood what failing at a specific endeavor meant, I wouldn't be as afraid of it. Or let me say it another way. Now that I understand what failing at a specific endeavor means, I'm not as afraid of it. I would still prefer to succeed if I get up in front of a group of people and read, or I do a radio interview and talk about my book. I'd rather be able to answer questions articulately and not go, I don't want to do that. And the odds are I'm not going to do that as long as I stay healthy. Um, and I have enough experience, and this is where this. I mean, we have enough experience in the world with other people, so the odds are we're not going to fail in the conversation, whether it's a business conversation, a coaching conversation, our podcast conversation together. So the experience, which leads to a lessening of ignorance, And if we're healthy, a lessening of arrogance leads to less fear. I would, in my experience. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. I mean, you did, and you sparked some other questions because I'm thinking now, just a quick summation during our conversation, that the precursor to fear is always ignorance, right? But you say that in most cases that because you're ignorant of a person's culture, you're ignorant of the outcome, you're ignorant of whatever the case may be, that's going to create fear. Because, like, for example, you know, you only have fear of heights in most cases because you haven't been exposed to heights. But once you get exposed to heights enough, now you're no longer ignorant about being suspended in high air or however that may be. The fear is not there,
Yeah.
you know. So, because again, the engineer in me, I'm always looking for how do you solve it. Even though, like I said, if I really, as I said before many times, it takes time and soul. You don't really solve it. You just come up with trade-offs.
Yeah.
But coming up with the trade-off of how do I deal with this fear as it relates to now bringing it politically. Because see, the reason I'm going with this line of thinking is I always ask questions when I do my other podcast, King Connections. One of the questions I ask individuals is, what are your morning rituals? What do you do to prepare yourself to kind of filter out all the negative noise that the media is trying to put in your mind? And 9 times out of 10, most of the time, what they're trying to put in is fear, right? It's crime, it's violence, it's whether it's political wokeism. They're trying to come for your kids. All that language is being used constantly to try to put fear in you. So it seems to me that life now, if you're walking down life and you're on a journey, and I know this is an oversimplification, but it's almost to the point where it's like that you really want to become on a path of becoming more fully human. What you really have to learn how to do is really manage and navigate and control your fear. Because if you don't, then that's going to take you to a variety of different. Almost people can control you, and that's what politicians, in my mind, want to do is control you, at least control you in certain actions to get you to do certain things.
Yeah. So I agree with what you said. The only way I would qualify the fear is I would say a non-rational fear. The vast majority of non-rational fears are grounded in some kind of ignorance, for sure. Again, if the tornado is 50 yards from where I am, and I feel some fear, that's rational to me. So I need to take cover. I need to do whatever, so that's a rational fear. But the non-rational fears of different people and different viewpoints, can I say 100%? No, but I would say a vast majority of the time are grounded in ignorance. And which leads me to, to to spread it out into a larger context for a second. And this gets into the semantics between fear, worry, concern about things, because those are fear is where when we're afraid, we're really a fear. The heart rate goes up. We get blood goes into our extremities because that's evolutionary. We're getting ready to flee, to fight, and freeze is part of that now too. But we're getting ready to do battle basically. But in terms of what to really be concerned about in this country now, because of the examples you use, where whether it's left or right, the media is designed to keep us afraid and worried. This again, my view of the country, and this is a real broad generalization of it, but the founding fathers gave us a country that we now know was biased towards wealthy, educated white men. Didn't include women, didn't include the local farmer. Farmers couldn't vote, early on. Obviously didn't include Native Americans or slaves, African Americans. And we've taken steps to remedy lots of that. It's not done yet, but it's better than it was. But if we look really carefully at how the country has manifested, they gave us this system, and again, this is a simplification, but I think it's accurate, where the state, the government, primarily needed to monitor and guide the market. It wasn't a completely free marketplace. I mean, you could go all the way back to people selling cotton in the South and the early industry in the North. It wasn't completely free. There were some laws, which the government was doing that to try to make sure the market didn't monopolize anything or take advantage of individual people. And then it was up to the people in a representative democracy to control and kind of bind and make sure that the state didn't lose control. And if you look at that carefully, we've failed at that because basically right now the market controls the state. There are large actors beginning decades ago with the steel industry, the fossil fuel industry, and other major industries, and now with the tech industries and companies that are much more powerful in many ways than the governments, except in making war. And the people are so disengaged with national politics that we can no longer check our federally elected officials. We can do a better job locally, but the state no longer checks the marketplace. So the marketplace controls everything in many ways with lobbyists. And the people are disinterested or are ignorant and don't know how to check the government. Because look at the Congress. The Congress of the United States doesn't get anything done anymore. That's an exaggeration. They get occasionally, they can do something. But if you want to be concerned about something, rather than somebody whose skin pigmentation is different from yours or whose sexual orientation is different or whatever trait, be concerned with the state of our democratic republic, because the market, industry and lobbying controls elected officials on the federal level. To a lesser degree, they do it on the state level. And the people don't really, have a lot of power in their annual, their biannual and voting, because the politicians get paid a lot more donations by lobbyists, especially in Congress, than they get paid by any, and then there's a handful of people who don't, like someone like Bernie Sanders. Whether somebody's left or right, I don't care. But Bernie Sanders doesn't take corporate money. One of my senators, Chris Murphy, doesn't take corporate money in Connecticut. The woman, and there's others, I don't know all of their names, but they only take individual contributions. So they're doing their best to stay separate from the lobbyists, which is hard work. But if I have a fear, it's basically the disintegration of the democracy I was led to believe we had, democratic republic. That, Benjamin Franklin's famous quote, when coming out of one of the constitutional conventions, some woman said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of a government are you going to give us?" And his response was, "A republic, if you can keep it." Because he understood what they were doing.
Right.
And retired Supreme Court Justice David Souter said that his greatest fear, he said this in 2012, wasn't foreign invasion or blah, blah, blah. He said his greatest fear was civic ignorance, that the people of the United States don't know how the government works. And in polls, it's frightening. Many people, tens of millions, can't name the three branches of the government. They can't tell you what the executive branch does, the legislative branch, or the judicial branch does. And if they can't name it into federal level, they probably can't tell you what their local lawmakers do either, or their governor, or their state legislator. So that's the biggest thing to be concerned about, because it's not an automatic thing that everything is going to be okay. And you can see that now, where there are crazy people in Congress, people who make up, people who, who said that they believe that the government is run by, these baby-eating pedophiles, and some of them got elected. I mean, that's a true story. I mean, that's terrifying. So fear is a useful emotion when it's grounded in something that's really a threat. It tends to lead to a lot of problems when it's grounded in ignorance.
I think about our discussion last week. We talked about ignorance, and you talked about ignorance on a federal level, and then I thought about the ignorance people have on a local level. Like we talked about again, federal, they can't name, most people can't name three branches of government. Then you look at on a local level, most people can't even name what district they're in, or maybe who's their council person in a particular district because they're not engaged in this. And I believe that comes back to a systematic issue, which is designed to keep people. Because think about it, the media, the news, they feed us the same repetitive information over and over again. So if your news media start off, or the media you listen to just came off and talking about the districts on a regular basis, people would know their districts because it's talked about in a very common conversation. It's important to know your district, right? Who you're voting for, why you're voting, what are some of the things that impact your district as it relates to that. Like most people definitely know what state they're in, they know what county they're in, they know what city they're in, so you have that understanding, but then they chop things up in districts. That's, to me, that's intentional to keep people from being engaged. To your point about being civic minded. Now, this leads to my question now. And again, this is why I'm saying it's a common sense answer, but that's why I believe it's systemic, that it's not going to be done that way when it comes down to, DeSantis talks about what we're not going to teach in schools. How about talking about what we are going to teach in schools when it comes to civics? How about standing up and saying, okay, we need to be more civic minded. So I want to make sure I'm going to pass legislation that civics get a key part in our schools at an earlier age. See, that to me would be much more of a politician looking to improve people's lives as opposed to push forth your agenda.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And to your point about the districts and the local politics as opposed to the state and the national, I mean, it used to be that that they used to really have town halls where you'd go to the town hall and you could yell at your representative or yell back or whatever. And it was it wasn't always civil. 200 years ago, they would yell at each other and have difference of opinion. So it's not like it's that different now. The difference is that getting access beyond the local level to a politician is really hard, and that we get fed our news through major industries and major corporations who have algorithms that feed us more of what they think we want. So they have this huge system that has beaten this artificial intelligence that has beaten the best chess players in the world. And for me as a consumer and as a voter, it's a lot of work to get to the truth of something, because if those algorithms can beat, I forget the Russian guy's name now that he beat, then it's smarter than I am too. So it's a lot of work to get to something that approaches the truth. And so it's the whole, the whole system is really designed, to serve those who are in power, both in terms of wealth and position, and to kind of control what happens. And I'm much more convinced of that than I ever was. That it's until something is done with that, getting the money, getting the lobbyists out of Washington, D.C., and changing how we vote and getting rid of the Electoral College, none of this is going to change.
Right.
I believe, because it serves the people who already have the power.
Absolutely. And then keep people civically ignorant.
Yeah.
They don't realize, again, a lot of folks don't realize what the Electoral College is or how it functions until it's election time. Then you get told how it functions against your particular voting interests. But most people don't realize how now is the time to be active about how to go about making those changes.
Yeah.
Well, that to me is an excellent segue into our next section, which is, again, on our podcast, we don't just lay out what the problems are, the issues. We want to look at having practical solutions. So, with the topic of fear, what are some of the solutions that you would suggest that people begin to follow, or directions they can go in to have them either deal with it, combat it, or manage it?
And so two things come to mind. One I already mentioned, which I'll repeat. Um, One is when I recognize that I'm afraid of something, is to really do a self inquiry. Okay, is in terms of, okay, what am I really afraid of? And, just I'll use race. So if my answer is black people as a white guy, then say, okay, so how many times has a black person done something to me that I should be afraid? Okay, so in my life, that's zero. So what am I really afraid of? And keep asking that question. What is the basis of my fear? So whether it's fear of Republicans, fear of Democrats, fear of whatever, what am I really afraid of? And be honest with yourself. Get to the heart of it. See if it's a rational fear or not. That's one. The second, and that's more of an internal thing to do. The second one is what I mentioned earlier, is if you bump into someone who you think you're supposed to be afraid of, is practice trust and kindness and say hello, say good morning, say how are you today, make eye contact. In other words, be the first person to drop your fear. And my experience is, and I've done this again, it's in New York City, in the suburbs in Connecticut, in Yonkers, in Tucson, Arizona, the vast majority of people say hello. Not everybody. Some people's lives are horrible. They're lucky to get up in the morning and they're just outside and they're trying to survive the day. They might be afraid of me because I'm being friendly, wondering what I want from them. But the vast majority of people just say hello. So interrogate your own fear, get to the heart of it. What am I really afraid of? Is there anything there? And then be the first one to be trusting. Be kind to somebody. Say hello, good morning, how are you? Those two things work in my experience.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I think those are great tips. Let me move into the next and final section, which is to share an example of a human being, whether it's past or present, someone who believe has exhibited or is exhibiting their fully human characteristics.
Yeah. So I'll jump in first if that's okay. So I actually had lunch yesterday with one of my cousins, a guy who's my big brother growing up. I think I mentioned that earlier. He's my cousin, but he was 6 years old, so I didn't have a brother, so he was a good basketball player. And he was a teacher for 30 years. He was the mayor of a small town, a bedroom community in New York City called Dobbs Ferry, New York. He was mayor there for 9 years. Really just grounded, good guy, cancer survivor now. We had lunch with him yesterday, and we hadn't caught up in a while. And I want to tell a quick story because I knew the big part about this story, but I didn't know a little part about it. So while he was the mayor of Dobbs Ferry, the hospital in Dobbs Ferry Hospital had an abortion clinic in it. It was a place where you get abortions. This is back in the 80s, where there was a lot of, not that issue was done. And there was a group, a pro-life group that named themselves something like Project Goliath. And they would go to different places where there were abortion clinics and lay down in the street, stop traffic, close down streets and everything. And they said they were going to go to small towns around New York. And they chose this town. And he was a moderate Republican. He ran as a Republican, but grounded guy. And so he was interviewed by like the New York City stations and everything. And so he made a statement that made it across the country into all the major newspapers. So when they were asked about, what he thought as the mayor, what was going to happen if this Project Goliath or whatever they called it came to Dobbs Ferry, he said, well, one thing I know, he said, in Dobbs Ferry, we have some people who are pro-life. We have some people who are pro-choice, and everybody in Dobbs Ferry is against Project Goliath. And so that went with, how perfect is that as somebody who, as a mayor, he represents all of the people.
Right.
And that made it into the Los Angeles Times. Like it was across the country. So I didn't know like how famous that had become. He told me that story yesterday. But he's just just a really good guy. I remember him when he was 16, how good he was to me I was 10 when he was 16. He has 2 grown kids. He has grandkids. He's retired now from teaching. Just a good guy. And as we talk about being fully human, uh, I think he's an example of that. And, very personal for me because he was, I told him again, I wish he had been a cross country runner because I would have done that instead of trying to play basketball. I probably would still have good hips. but, so that's my fully human example, Don Mara.
Okay. My example is I'm going to list a movie star, actor, writer, director, activist, um, ran for political office as well, Tom Laughlin.
Hmm.
And, I remember when I was a kid seeing his movies, Billy Jack, the 4 Billy Jack movies, and the impact, influence to this day, those movies still have them. I still remember certain lines, certain scenes from those movies. And I saw him when I was a little kid, and I saw him as a teenager, and I saw him as a young adult, and just seeing him as a hero and fighting against injustice and, standing up to the bullies at that time and just watching how he stood up for Native Americans, how he practiced that self-discipline and seeing how even at, personal injury to himself, making sacrifices to improve his lives. And he did that in his own life as well. So to me, I don't think he got his kudos for being a great filmmaker, writer, producer. He also ran for Congress.
Yeah.
He ran for president successfully as well. So to me, that's somebody who was committed to just being about justice. He could have did a movie about anything. He did a movie that showed that he was fighting for the rights of Native Americans because he felt that they were being mistreated. And he showed that at a time when you didn't really see that in movies.
Yeah.
He definitely didn't see a hero stand up for someone who didn't look like him, color-wise, and fight for those on that side and have that kind of love. So I just recently saw a video on YouTube about him. So I wanted to make sure I had an opportunity to give him his flowers because, like I said, he's definitely someone. My brother and I, to this day, still make a joke about one of the lines he said in the movie where he's talking to one of the bullies because he had done something to one of the kids. I think he had put flour on one of the kids' heads.
Yeah.
And the sheriff came along and was defending the bully. And he said, I'm going to take this foot. I'm going to put it on that side of your face. There's not going to be a damn thing you can do about it. And the guy's like, yeah, really? And he says, really? And he doesn't. He kicks him. That never leaves my mind. That's there permanently implanted. Like I said, I must have saw that when I was 7 years old. So kudos to Tom Laughlin.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great example because I was, I'm a little bit older than you, so I saw those when I was a little bit older, but I probably have I own that on a DVD. So I can quote.
Okay.
I'm not going to quote any, but I love that movie. I love the first one most. I think it's hard to make sequels, but the first one I can say a lot of lines from there. So I love that as an example of Tom Laughlin for sure. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, this has been another great show, a great topic. I think fear is something we can probably build on for several episodes just because of how entrenched the system has for it to be used to control people, to manipulate people, to cause people to act or cause people to not act. And, we can definitely talk about those in other episodes, but I think it was a great topic. And I think it's something that you laid out for us people, how to manage, control it, minimize it. I think those steps are definitely key. And of course, if it resonates with you and you're on that journey to become more fully human, then I definitely encourage you to heed this advice, purchase the book, and look for ways to, as you say, act and practice kindness as many opportunities as you can. So with that being said, I want to thank you again, Reggie, for having and producing another great show, for thinking about the topic, for being fully engaged, being fully present, and of course, living a life of being a fully human individual. I also want to thank our listening audience for listening to another episode, whether it's live or whether you listen to the replay. We look forward to engaging with you. Definitely feel free to put your comments, your thoughts. What are we not discussing that you want to see us discuss? and what would you like to see us talk about a little bit more in depth. But until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., I want everyone to continue to pursue the path and the journey of becoming more fully human. Thank you.